problem associated with the use of SSRIs is related to what is arguably their mechanism of action in relieving the symptoms of anxiety and depression. People end up often caring less about what goes on around them, things in general. They're just less concerned, less bothered. Now, when this effect is striking, as it sometimes is, people can seem really quite remote to those who are close to them. Their immediate family members may notice that they just don't have the same contact, the same warmth, the same empathy.
Evelyn Pringle is a journalist working and living in Green Bay, Wisconsin, US, who's become known for her ceaseless work exposing the corruption between companies and American politicians, not least when dealing with medicines.
I think what's important too to remember is that so many more people are taking these drugs and they're starting at a younger age. How is this going to affect the society as a whole when all different people in all different professions are taking these drugs and they don't feel empathy anymore, and they don't feel remorse, and they don't feel guilt, and they don't really feel anything? What does this do for all different professions if we have a society of people anymore that basically don't care? I mean, these people come across like they feel like they're self-centered. They don't seem to care if they upset people. They don't seem to care if, anybody's mad at them. It is not this. It is really the drugs that is damaging that part of the brain that controls this. And they're not self-centered. And they do care, but they don't feel it, so they don't show it. So if we have a whole society, as more and more people get on these psychiatric drugs and become like this, what is this going to do as society as a whole when we have doctors and teachers and judges and lawyers, everybody who don't seem to care anymore?
So antidepressive drugs called SSRIs have many side effects. One that patients experience as positive but that seems to fool the doctors is that you don't feel the same degree of pressure or expectations from people around you. It's like an invisible bubble that inhibits natural communication. And it's here that something very serious happens that researchers dare not speak about. A person's empathetic ability and conscience seem to be reduced. It gets harder to perceive the suffering of others and also one's own sorrows and losses. Often the surroundings are blamed for causing the patient's problems. He or she feels no need for close relations, nor do they react when a colleague's harassed. They drive past an accident without stopping, but they would not complain when visiting the doctor because they'd feel stronger. Proof that SSRI works is that soldiers in war situations receive SSRI medication against nightmares and bad conscience. With SSRI, the soldier is less burdened by the guilt brought on by his acts. Lisa Chedical, a recipient of the American Pulitzer Prize, wrote a series of articles in 2006 which shook the United States. Soldiers are treated with SSRI and commit suicide.
We found cases where the families of troops who would receive, after a troop commits suicide or dies in the war zone, receive an autopsy report or a criminal investigation report. If the cause of death is either suicide or not hostile, families get a report. There's an investigation done and families get a report, and families were seeing in the report that a soldier was put on Zoloft or Prozac or Celexa, and the families didn't know it while they were in the war zone. They'd be placed on these medications and then would commit suicide, and the families were telling us on the phone, they had no idea. And there's no indication in those cases that we found that the troops were monitored or received any counseling. And in some cases, the families had great concern when they saw Zoloft or Prozac. Was that a safe way to treat soldiers who are having anxiety and depression in the war zone?
The military then gives SSRIs to soldiers in war zones to lessen their sense of guilt and empathy, which might lead to nightmares and conscientious remorse. The soldier receives exactly the same drug as the Swedish judge, the teacher, or the doctor, Everything is hidden behind words like depression, trauma, or PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Professor Wolfgang Rutz has long experience of SSRI and its effects on men who've been at war.
Altså et av de kliniske symptomene på en dyp depresjon at ha forskyndelsesideer til den og den, eller da når jeg var på noe vis i början på mitt liv, har kränkt den och den personen, eller jag har svikit min partner, eller jag har svikit min familj. Då har jag försyndigat mig på ett sätt som inte kan gottgöras längre. Även om det är bagateller det rör sig om. Men det är ett väldigt typiskt tecken för djupa depressioner. Att ha den här känslan av att ha försyndigat sig, att ha kränkt någon, att ha gjort någonting som inte kan gottgöras. Så på det sättet kan man ju säga, liksom i det ögonblicket som jag behandlar den här depressionen, som ligger bakom de här försyndelseidéerna bland annat, så försvinner de här försyndelseidéerna och spelar inte någon roll längre. Och alltihopa liksom blir mer realistiskt och jag kan fortsätta att leva. Så på det sättet hänger det ihop att behandla med piller en djup depression och få försyndelseidéer och dåligt samvete på det sättet att försvinna.
You could be a mother or a girlfriend getting emails from your soldier, and Swedish soldier or US soldier, saying, help, I'm losing my mind, and you call the commander and say, send my son home. They're not sending people home. They're going to keep them there as much as possible, and the one way we found through our reporting to keep a soldier in the war zone is to place them on SSRIs.
The journalist Martha Rosenberg lives in Chicago. After interviewing many American soldiers, she's deeply worried about their experiences with SSRI.
When soldiers have been treated for their post-traumatic stress disorder with antidepressants, they are going to lack empathy for the people they might have harmed or killed, and empathy for themselves as somebody who was made into a killer. And as long as they remain on these drugs, they're not going to process the real emotions of empathy that are in almost all people, except psychopaths. Most people have a natural empathy. And so the SSRIs, I strongly believe, enable easier killing on the part of soldiers, but just as importantly, they enable the soldier to not approach that, and not deal with that in his own conscious or her own consciousness, because the drug has prevented the human emotions to be front and center.
Dee Mangin is a physician and director of the Primary Care Research Unit at the Christchurch, New Zealand School of Medicine. She has long experience of SSRI and is a popular lecturer worldwide.
These drugs can be helpful, and they can be helpful because they can relieve negative emotions like sadness and worry and grief. And these are normal human emotions that we all feel. It's part of being alive, and they're almost always distressing. So you would think that it would make sense if there was a pill that could take these away and make you feel better, that you should take it. But the trouble is, with every decision in life, there are always trade-offs. So the important thing to understand in removing the negative emotions of being alive, of day-to-day life, there's a trade-off, because if you take the pill to make you feel better, you also may reduce the capacity for feeling love, affection, caring. And so that has to be balanced against removing what are normal human emotions.
Careless syndrome on these drugs is one that poses huge problems for the judicial system and for life generally in any major democracy, which depends on subjects being able to responsibly sign contracts, undertake agreements of various sorts, and just for natural and normal social life. the bonds of a husband to their wife, the bonds of parents to their children, friends to each other. If we don't care in the normal way about these things, there is a risk that a husband is going to leave a wife and regret it afterwards, or that a mother will leave her children because she just doesn't have the normal feelings, and later will be very regretful. She may deny the grandparents access to the children. She just doesn't bring them to see the grandparents because she couldn't care less. These are things that can be very problematic for the grandparents. When these drugs came on the market first, we only looked at their effect on rating scales that looked at items like sleep and anxiety and things like that. We didn't check on the possible economic consequences. We didn't look to issues like, well, do people lose their jobs because they aren't as concerned about doing a good job as they had been before? Do their relationships break up? Do they have accidents in cars because they don't take the usual amount of care? These are all things that we simply don't know the answers for. We do know that people get careless on the drugs. You have to think that a proportion of those people will do things that they wouldn't have done if they hadn't been on the drugs, and which they will regret deeply afterwards. But aside from the personal regret, there is an issue generally for all of us. Are the contracts that are signed under the influence of these drugs valid contracts? Is the murder that is committed under the influence of a drug actually murder? Should the person who takes their own life under the influence of a drug be regarded as having committed suicide or not? Can they form the intent to kill themselves that people form when we consider it to be a valid suicide? We don't have answers to these things, and we won't get answers to these things unless the judiciary and the police and everybody who's involved in the things that can happen recognizes that there is an issue that we all need to think about, and we need to work out what is happening and what the appropriate levels of responsibility